Welcome to another episode of the Meter Cute interviews here on Meter and Mayhem. Today I'll be chatting with Patricia Brody, who's done everything from serving as an editor at Guitar Player magazine to practicing as a psychotherapist in New York. For the last few decades, she's turned her attention to poetry. You can find her work in places such as the Paris Review, Barrow Street, and Mom Egg Review. Her first collection, Dangerous to Know, came out in 2013 from the Irish press Salmon Poetry, and her most recent book is also out from the same press. It's called My Blazing World. Are you ready to learn more about her amazing life and her thoughts on poetry? Me too. So let's sit back, relax, and get ready to fall in love.
This is a poem from my new-ish book. The name of the book is My Blazing World, and the name of the poem is Right to Choose. The title of the poem was going to be the title of the collection, but I changed it over time. Right to choose. Underfoot, I will throw on some schmutta, but under stress, I turn to whiskey, or I whine, or other medication. Lately, I prefer meditation. Make it all go away. Only the moment matters. Let these thoughts go. I invited someone to take over. I loved when they climbed my tree, bound my hair to my own low bough. Oh, that thumb. You choose, I begged. And they did make a salad, hand me a fork, and let me make my own way home in the dark. The white branches hung heavy at dusk. I came to the edge of his park. No kid played at that hour. Why else do we who choose children? Yes, we cradle, coax them through the night. You have to shush, not make a move. Make sure they don't die in their sleep. But the Grand Prix to focus your high beam on someone else, not yourself. Lay thee down under unbalanced boulder, waiting for the fault, dear Portia, in our winking stars. Portia, for those who might not guess, is a woman figure in Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar. She is the wife of Brutus, and Brutus is the receiver of the comment, the fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings. And I wrote as an epigraph for this book, the fault, dear wife of Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings. I'll say a couple of things about the book before I go to another poem. One is that which is typical for me, I have probably 4 or 5 epigraphs because I'm always inspired by so many figures in literature and in life. And another epigraph is to the world's first known author. Her name was Enheduanna, and she lived approximately 2250 to 2286 BC. And how we know this is there was this wonderful exhibit of findings from evidence that she existed and that she dictated or wrote on stones, on slates, and these 2.5 centuries before Christ, And she wrote to Women Goddess. She's a remarkable figure, and to think she's the world's first known author, and we're speaking of she. She wrote, "I have given birth, O exalted lady, to this song for you." So that's another epigraph. And then one more piece of information for the book is that the title is My Blazing World. And this title was stolen or taken from another amazing woman figure named Margaret Cavendish, who lived, I think she lived in the 17th century, and she was known as Mad Madge to her own circles, or not supporters. She was ridiculed a lot. She was a poet, a playwright, somewhat of a female activist, and a scientist. And she's been rediscovered quite a few times now since the feminist studies, I think in the late 20th century, and certainly well into the current time. She's a well-known figure now in some circles, and she wrote a science fiction novel called The Blazing World. And so I took my title from her, My Blazing World. So I'm going to read a couple of other poems from this book. One, well, I think I'll do it this way. I started the book earlier. First, I started the book with a poem about a painting of the Virgin Mary in the Annunciation in the cloisters, this beautiful medieval museum in Manhattan, where I lived most of my adult life and where I was born. Now I don't live there, but, and I have two poems with this title, Imagine Birth, but I'm not going to read that because I'm going to read another one, which is called Rockaway Girl. My mother died just somewhat before this book came out. And it was such a trauma in some ways, even though she was quite old, that I needed to write about it. Of course, no one accepted poems about my dead mother and my grieving till somewhat later. This is Rockaway Girl, and Rockaway is also a place in Queens, formerly Brooklyn, called Far Rockaway. And Brooklyn's the trendiest place in the world now, but it's outdone Manhattan by far. But my mother and other people up until 15 years ago were embarrassed to say they came from there. So this is Rockaway Girl. Frigid March day, spring just around the bend. Mother's January, Dad's February at an end. Sky heavy, gray as milk. Sharp-edged snow chips slice my forehead. The wind fierce, fears light. Daylight savings begins tonight. Spring forward. She died, my mother, in another time zone. Not the one we enter now. How terrible to leave her back there in February. Spring will bloom without her. Oh, please come up and see my dogwoods, she'll say. My trees are simply gorgeous. A girl from Far Rockaway encountering blossoms her first time. I'll read about another kind of mother, very different. And then I have one more I think I'll go to from my other book that launched me into poetry, well, in a way, as an adult. This is called Sylvia Had No Starbucks. Keep in mind that when Starbucks came to the East Coast anyway, we didn't yet have the coffee house culture that other places like Europe had before. So this was not until the late 80s. And if you had children before that, you often had no place to go to meet and greet and hang out. You were stuck sometimes in this, terrible loneliness at home. Sylvia had no Starbucks. You don't think it would have made all the difference? She could have bundled those wailing toddlers into a pram, zipped them tight to their chins, promised steamed milk and nutmeg or kitty-size hot chocolate, instead of leaving those two cooling cups right by her trail to the oven. In the cheerful atrium out from that infamous freeze, she might have sat and read the paper, jotted a poem. She might have chatted with another mother. She could have been lulled, stretched her limbs, stopped chiseling her chilled statue, dared a laugh at the Minotaur, Daddy, or Ted, picked up a tidbit for later in bed, instead of ramming her throbbing head, her ish, ish, ish into the stove, sucking the sweet, hissy fumes as if gas were sleep and the hot words spilled down over the spotless floor. I guess I've written quite a bit about the children bring sorrow and joy. Not having a family is so hard. Having a family is so hard. I like to speak up for women's voices. I think I would, let's see, I plan to read, I'm just looking more. This is a sonnet, and it also has a woman in it, but she is a figure of a woman called Memory. And she is one of my muses. She is actually a sculpture in a park in Upper Manhattan called Strauss Park. It's right at an intersection of 106th Street and Broadway. It's a little triangle park, and it was named and dedicated by the family of two older people that went down with the Titanic. Their descendants lived on 106th Street, and there was this little triangle of land that became a beautiful garden and a statue cast, I believe, a bronze of this gorgeous reclining woman named Memory, who actually was a model who had a very sad life, and I wrote about her too. But this is called The Strausses' Return to Broadway. You look cold, Memory, frost on bronze, your fleshy arms made hard by first snow. Bare maples, ginkgos gaze stiff behind you, their trunks in icy sleeves so thin, God knows they freeze. Loving, frigid water streaming from their hair. Old pair who sailed with the Titanic, seaweed received them, limbs entwined. Never has death been lovelier. Winter brings violet, dusk, and gold. You've been thinking something here since 1915, your dreaming feet, your gown in chilly folds. Above your bowed head, love's branches quiver, as if summer, hidden silver, spoke. Well, I feel an obligation to read something about war. So maybe I'll substitute that for the poem I was going to read, Mad, Bad, and Dangerous to Know. I have several journeys going on, and one is I'd love to dive into the past, which in some ways was romantic, in some ways brutal. So, but I think I better read this because of what's going on in the world now. And sorry. No, oh, here it is. I thought it was at the end of my collection, but it's actually toward the beginning, which is where I write about many of the children-related poems. This is a kind of pantoum, and I hope I'll get to talk a little bit about my use and my non-use of form. And this has its run-on title, which I don't know if you can see, but it says Wars and Mothers, and Mothers and Wars, and Mothers and Wars, and Mothers and Wars, and Mothers and Wars, and it goes on. My mother died. Russia invaded Ukraine. One thing, nothing to do with the other. This was not the first invasion. Babies born, their eyes wide open. Mothers clutch their children close. New maniac is on the loose. Slate blue to black are baby's eyes. She couldn't swallow a drop of juice. The maniac is on the loose. She clenched her teeth against the spoon. No longer could she drink clear water. Her high, sharp bones, straggling hair, drooping lids, howling mouth, tribe and color, measure mercy, Mongol bones, tangled hair. Who to let in, who to keep out? Tribe or color, measure mercy. We too barred from every shore, who to let in, who to keep out. They stripped them, shot them down the pit. The other barred from every shore. Children's blood spills to the sea. Soldiers play catch with someone's baby, crying, Mama, who can't answer. Full circle ghosts of Babi Yar. Soft-skinned babies close their eyes. No poem blocks the blood-cursed bullet. Mother died. The war broke out. Sorry to end on a down note.
Wow. Patricia, that last poem really got me. I mean, your work has this way of like I'm trying to think of the right words. You kind of with that poem and then also with the Sylvia Plath poem, you sort of lull the reader in with a sense of like just quotidian and oh, this is just a little poem. And then like at the end, you're like you bring it. That's what I'm saying at the end. And I think that really intensifies the impact that your words have. Um, and reminding people how much of the daily has trauma and terror and things to deal with. That's to put it mildly. But my brain's still trying to get back
Sorry.
on track. That was that was that was, and I'm not usually a Pantoum fan. And I that was very that was a wonderful poem. Thank you for sharing it with us.
Thank you for receiving it, Jen. I kind of have to be sorry as I didn't want to bring sorrow to our our room, our space.
Well, I think we'll have we'll have a nice balance of the sorrow and the joy, I think. And that's, that's good for life to balance them rather than, there are some people who just ignore the sorrow and that doesn't work out so well for them, I think. So it's okay. Well, a question that I have for you, because you mentioned a lot of different poets and a lot of different different things and writing as you were reading. So it makes me curious about who your favorite metrical poet or poets, if you can't narrow it down, who's your favorite?
Well, I think instead of narrowing it down, there's no doubt, because I say it just about everywhere, that, you know, if my word or I'm talking to people gets out there. While I grew up with the metrical poet, probably one of the ones that made a lot of impact was Robert Frost. And I know you did a recent interview where somebody talks about him. Wasn't really the nicest guy, but I'm not, and I memorized Stopping by the Woods and named a poem after that too. But I won't talk, he's an early childhood favorite, but I kind of decided to bring to our talk together three poets. Well, one is two poets. The first in chronology is William Wordsworth and his sister, Dorothy Wordsworth, whom many of us hopefully know. Dorothy was instrumental in bringing images of nature from her journal, and more than images of nature, long lines of description and feeling, to her brother's enormous volumes, not just volumes, influence to his work, to William's work. And I was reawakened to poetry and the excitement of it when I went back to school in my 50s, when I learned about Dorothy Wordsworth and William. I didn't even like Wordsworth's. I thought it was sort of too flowery and metrical, some of it might be. I thought that he wasn't too penetrable for me. But then when I learned about their lives and their collaboration, and dreamt about it and see it in my mind whenever I see daffodils, I have to give, I've written two poems I won't read, but they're in I've written more than two, but they're in one of my books about Dorothy, and given her a lot of space to come back and talk to us. And I wrote metrical poems, although even what I read is not strictly metrical, or, I break the rules more than I don't. But I have written a sonnet and some sapphics about Dorothy. Then the other two were, well, my mentor in graduate school, and I discovered her in a book that Annie Finch co-edited. And I've often said in that community that Annie Finch now heads, the Poetry Witch community, or the spiral, as we like to call it, of metrical poets, that the book, A Formal Feeling Comes, which I think was published in the 80s, changed my poetry life from then on, because I suddenly found out about these women poets I didn't know. Most of them I never heard of or barely knew, and I never even noticed that they were all writing in form, and all of them did this remarkable thing. First, they presented their poems, and then they told why they decided to appropriate or subvert or give themselves over to what we used to call traditional forms that were mostly delivered by the dead white poets of the past. It turns out poets aren't dead. And their beautiful fire, comes across the centuries. So that book really made a difference to me, introduced me to the poetry of Marilyn Hacker. And she was directing the creative writing program at City College of New York. And they didn't even have MFAs yet. They just had, you could only go for a master's or later a PhD. But so it was a master's program, and it was called creative writing, but we were compelled to take literature courses, and it just changed my life, broke open the doors to history of women writers. And so the first book, Dangerous to Know, is written in the voices of women writers that a lot of them were erased or ignored until some of them rather recently, including Dorothy Wordsworth. Marilyn writes these amazing, amazing poems Earlier in her career, she wrote a lot of love poetry, very erotic, erotic, lesbian, but it was very inclusive of anyone reading them. You could get it. The eroticism and life and fire of her poems was great. So Marilyn Hacker, one of my favorites, definitely my mentor. I could read a few lines of hers, or
Okay. I'd love to hear some.
I'm going to read this first. One of the things Marilyn Hacker does is she writes sonnet sequences brilliantly. She also writes all kinds of other meters I can't even identify. These are 12-line stanzas. They might be a specific form. They are a form, but I don't know the name of it. But the name of this, and it relates to something that I'm involved with now, which is form and meter. The name of this is feeling and form. Well, it's about writing and poetry. So she's writing a letter to a friend of hers, Dear San. Everybody doesn't write poetry. A lot of people doodle profiles, write something they think approximates poetry because nobody taught them to read poetry. Rhyming or trailing gerunds, clumps of words straggle a page, unjustified. Poetry? It's not like talking, so it must be poetry. Before they learn to write, all children draw pictures. Grown-ups teach them how not to draw. Anyone unlearns the craft of poetry too. And then the fourth grader who gets a neat likeness of mom in crayons, not unlike the woman who sent you her tone poem, who'd like her admiration praised. That isn't poetry unless she did the work that makes it like this. Any work in outrage, love, or liking an apple's October texture. Write about anything. I wish I could. I have to stop because it goes on very long. Well,
So what's your favorite thing about that particular poem that you wrote, that you read?
well, you don't even notice how rhymey it is. And I think I don't even know if it's purely, I think, what's my favorite? It's the artlessness, which it seems to be written, like it's almost quotidian speech. And yet she's really expressing very strong opinions. Well, she says, write about anything. I wish I could. It's like the still lives you love. You don't have to like apples to like Cézanne. I do like words, which is why I make things out of words and listen to their hints, resounding like skipping stones, radiating circles, drawing context from text, the way I've watched you draw, and it goes on and on. So she paints pictures, she tells theories and opinions, and all of this is, it's pretty much all rhyming, and it's a very few words. Poetry, like, unlike, poetry, like, unlike. It's almost a sestina, but it's definitely not a sestina. And let's see how she ends it. This poetry, I would say at this time now in our history in 2024, it's not very much in style already. And it was pretty radical when she started publishing, I guess, in the 80s, probably earlier, but in the 70s. I'm sure she published in the 70s. And she was radical. She goes on, it's so many different transformations of her first images, drawing, writing, poetry. Something else I notice about what you said about the poems I read, that I do tend to bring, not always, but I tend to bring the poem to an end that's dramatic, I guess. And that was something I'd also say started to fight against in the 90s and all the way through now, started happening in the 90s, that the women, let's just say the women who wrote, well, Yeats did it too, and Shakespeare too, but if bringing the poem to an end became uncool, and that, for instance, Sharon Olds, who had sock it to you poems, would, I mean, that's why I started writing, because I said, well, if she can do that, I can at least try. And then she just reversed it almost, and then you don't know kind of what she's talking about. Very languagey, John Ashbery. And the one I remember the best, because I was in a poetry workshop class with her at NYU, Jory Graham, we're the same age, and she became a sort of superstar in the, I don't know when it was, again, I guess the late 80s or so. And she made fun of making a poem that has a turn or has an ending. And you'll see if you read her poems, she doesn't turn much, or very subtly. And so I guess what I've been finding, these women that, and Wordsworth and maybe even Byron and Keats, they go all over the place, but they do bring it home. And I'm trying to think, well, of, yes, and so do other poets in other languages. I was reading recently a Polish poet named Anna Swir, S-W-I-R, and she has a poem called Virginity, and it's nothing about what you think. So she brings it to an end. The other person of the three that I wanted to mention is one who's not well recognized enough. Certainly in New York, she's was well known. She died a few years ago at 98, Marie Ponsot, Ponsot. It is a French name, but she herself pronounced it in New York, Ponsot. So she said people would know how they were supposed to spell it. She was a character, a longtime teacher in the CUNY college system, a CUNY University, City University of New York. She taught at Queens College. Oh yeah, I want to say that especially my second collection is much about New York, places, moods, from Washington Heights, Harlem, to the Lower East Side, I suppose, to Brooklyn. The Hudson River is really important to me. I've written about it a lot. So these are landmarks for me and for many of these New York poets, not the New York school, that's different. Marie also was a New York poet, and she was pretty radical. I found among women, and this, again, I guess a good thing to listen for is the slant rhyme. It looks like free verse. There's 3 stanzas. The one in the middle is a single line. And here it is. It's called Among Women. On the notes we've been discussing. What women wander? Not many, all, a few. Most would now and then, and no wonder. Some, and I'm one, wander sitting still. My small grandmother bought from every peddler less for the ribbons and lace than for their scent of sleep where you will. Walk out when you want, choose your bread and your company. She warned me, have nothing to lose. She looked fragile, but had high blood, runner's ankles, could endure. She loved her rooted garden, her grandchildren, her once wild, once young man. Women wander as best they can.
And that was Marie Ponsot
Yes.
or Ponsot, depending on who was.
Yeah, no, they most people know her as Ponsot, but I remember learning that and she had so much male narcissism to contend with. Oh, she had 7 children, 6 sons and 1 daughter.
Whew.
And it was the daughter. I mean, her sons helped, but the daughter stayed by her through her life, through her whole life. It's hard to be a daughter sometimes.
Yes. um so all this talk about the talk about narcissism and things like that, and dealing with other people that has been sort of coming up here, makes me want to know, what advice would you give to a younger version of yourself? It doesn't have to be like a young, I mean, like, just, some earlier version of you. What
Well,
advice would you give?
just on the narcissistic note, my daughter says I am, narcissistic, and I don't think she is particularly. I have 2 sons also. Then I have another career. I was born into the field of psychoanalysis and psychiatry. My father was an early one, and then I studied it. I always studied both literature writing and psychology, starting in college, and it went on forever. And I went to social work school before I came out. Well, no, I studied both in college, but then later I went to social work school and much later went to graduate school as a would-be writer. So I got to say that about narcissism. Oh, and the other thing, there's a famous book written about, I guess it's about Byron. I know the author, I can't remember the name of the book. The author, she makes the case that Lord Byron and all other artists are bipolar. So I guess that would be beyond healthy narcissism. Um,
When
it's
I think it
touched by fire. That's what it's called.
I think it becomes, it's an interesting game to play to psychoanalyze writers, but I think it's also a dangerous game to play, right? Like, so if you want to say all writers are bipolar, well, I'm not
Oh,
bipolar, I have CPTSD. So does that mean I don't get to be a writer or not a good
no, no,
one?
no, no, no.
Because,
She didn't
right?
say, she said all artists, but why, yeah, why would she, now that maybe I'm misquoting her and hopefully she won't find me, but I think she did make a case for it, or it might be a past therapist of mine who was also really, really helpful and does it. She told me I never got poetry. When I brought her my first book, she said, maybe you'll go over some of these with me sometime because I wouldn't know what to do with them. So anyway, blah, 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 the boundaries, all kinds of medical fields now are bringing poetry into healing, psychiatry, organic, all kinds. So you're right. You're right,
Yeah,
Jen.
there's there's even the Journal of Poetry Therapy too, right?
Yeah,
Um, so yeah,
it is therapy. It's
huh?
healing. It's therapeutic, like a good, I mean, I'm not saying it's therapy, but it is therapeutic, like nature is therapeutic and a hot or, a swim can be therapeutic. So what advice?
Yeah.
I was a very frightened child. And with all my nice, loving poetry, my mother was impossible, and she definitely had narcissistic personality disorder, although, she was very high functioning, went to Smith, like Sylvia, just before Sylvia Plath, I guess a good bit before, and kind of, they reminded me of each other a little bit, but my mother didn't kill herself. She somehow got through it, but of her 3 children, I think I'm the one that got the goods from her. My sister's gone. She died about a year ago. And oh my God, relationships are just so hard and can be so painful. But so I was frightened as a child, afraid. And I still am. So what advice could I give? I think something I learned from having children, you can't, it's better to love too much than too little. And nothing is free, nothing is pain-free, but to be afraid to ask for what you want. I was afraid. I was afraid to ask my mother when I was a little kid. I was just afraid to ask her, Mommy, take care of me. Mommy, please don't act angry at me. I just said to somebody in authority 2 nights ago, don't try not to be so irritable with me. It's hurtful. And it helped. The person pulled back a little bit and said they were sorry. And that's all, it helped. So I think I would say ask for what you need, which is hard when you're a child because you're intimidated. And
And especially if, I mean, I don't, you haven't, well, anyway, it can be especially difficult when you're not sure what the response will be. And
and my
if you're
yeah,
a smart kid and you're trying to figure out a situation, you're like, you can't figure it out because the response might be one thing one time and another thing another time. And so your little logic brain is trying to be like, wait, but what's the pattern? There's no pattern.
right, the unreliable narrator, the unreliable mother or caregiver, where you don't know. You're absolutely right. And I'm sure it's easy for me to say I should have said, Mommy, be nice to me. But geez, I mean, she should have been nice without my asking her, and then I could have asked her. Um, and so all of this comes with knowledge and self-reflection and therapy and writing, and you couldn't know then. And but also as an older person, I'm thinking how much time we waste, but we can't help it, on pain and suffering, but we can't help it. And I think, way after I was, some kind of a grown up, at least if not in my 20s, my 30s, I remember my dad, who was the more loving, able to express it of the two parents, said, walking is a great cure. I don't know whether he said cure, but walking is a great help. And it really, if only somebody could have said, if only he could have taken me for a walk and said, this is good for you. Look, notice that you're doing step by step. You're walking, you're alive. Instead, he said, come on, let's go out for a walk. And I said, no, I don't want to. And then I used to look at physical activity with a little bit, I'd much rather stay home and read. And they were always pushing me to leave, get out of the house and play and be out there. And I just wanted to stay in and read. And now I would say, if somebody could have taught me how great walking is, how comforting nature is.
And Wordsworth walked a lot too. Walked
Yes.
and all that stuff.
Yeah, that whole thing of tranquility, recollecting, what was it? Powerful emotions in tranquility. How do you learn that? I mean, that's so, when I say that, it makes me feel, that I've gotten a dose of something good. But yeah, he did walk a lot in his beautiful English countryside. But I used to get the walking cure, right? Not always, but lots of parts of Manhattan I find very therapeutic
Yeah.
walking around. I love shops and love coffee. Oh, what I could have told myself when I was a little kid, go to Starbucks, hang out with some other people.
There you
Yeah.
go. Yeah. Yeah. Is there any advice that you think a younger version of yourself, so not necessarily the scared younger child, even, but if one of your past selves showed up via time machine and saw your life now, is there any advice that you think that she would impart on you?
I know what I have. I have a problem with it right now. Not asking you, Jen. You're very generous and giving of all your skills. And I am just so glad that I met you on PWC. So we have to thank Annie Finch, and I do thank her for that. But I still can't ask for what I want. I want more people to read my poems. I want more people to share what I create with me. And then I love to share what they create too. So I can't, it's hard to ask for what I want. I mean, it's so astounding to find someone who likes a poem and wants to publish it. You know, it's such a big deal because, gee whiz, why would they like anything I have to say? And we're so much more often shot down than embraced and accepted. More hugs, please. You know, more hugs. I mean, they can just be written hugs. Um, sometimes sometimes somebody says big hugs and I feel like they don't mean it, or it's not sincere, or there's something buried in it that I don't like. But when I know the person is well-meaning and has a lot of heart and is, oh, I know what it is. And I learned this in both psychology and I see it in writing. Learn, what do you really mean? What do you really mean? If someone says, oh, I'm so sorry, but I hate you. No, I'm so sorry, but you don't belong, or your poem doesn't belong, or your kind of thinking doesn't belong. They're not sorry at all. They really don't, you know, and I wish I could say when I feel rejected, okay, why do you not like me? Or what makes me so what are you objecting to? So I want people to say what they mean, even, for instance, the person I said who said something that, you know, I have to ask you to stop doing this. It's very distracting. And I said, please don't be so irritable. It was easier that the person said something direct than if they were just like passive aggressive and pushed me. You know, they said what they wanted. They were annoyed. And now that I think of it, I'd prefer that than if people try to couch their anger in like that indirect hostile communication that you have to dig for, and then they tell you you're crazy because they didn't mean anything bad. So I don't know what is that advice? Again, I guess ask them what they really mean. Um, I'd like to get my poetry out there as much as I can before I die. And and don't be afraid to write, Patricia. Don't be afraid to write it. Go for it. Don't be afraid to write it.
Yeah, write it and submit it, send it out to places, because they're not gonna, very seldom will they come knocking on anybody's door who's not a, you know, big name.
Superstar. Yep. And look, even a person who, her publisher, Marie Ponsot, was Knopf. I mean, you know, and her books, if you will, they sold in New York. And she had hundreds of followers and she wasn't recognized. So if she, the super, and many volumes, her first publisher, by the way, was City Lights, probably in the 50s. And it's crazy, right? And so if somebody who gets that much following still isn't recognized, you might as well go for it. What do you have to lose? All they can say is no, right?
Exactly. And you know, I had so I have a a friend from long ago who I don't really talk too much anymore, but he man, he would put himself out there for everything. And you would think, why is he applying for that? There's no way. That's ridiculous. And it was with jobs and fellowships and grants and submitting places. And you just thought, what? And now I ask myself, what would this person do? Right? Like, would he apply for this thing? Well, yeah, probably. So, okay, do it. So you just have to figure out who to compare yourself to and be like, well, so and so would do it. Okay, I'm gonna do it.
You know, this is very inspiring because you're doing this, Jen, and I know you were starting it with Meter Cute.
Yeah.
And that is great title, great name. I didn't even know what meet cute meant till again, way into my adulthood. But yeah, I think, again, there were other psychoanalysts who wrote books and got their bit of fame in the circles. They they didn't become Shakespeare, but in their circles, they had their fame. And my dad was frustrated by that. And he wanted to write a book. He wrote many articles, and he was a great healer, my dad. He was out there, radical. But later in his life, I said, why didn't you write a book if you want to so much, or why don't you? And he said, I guess I didn't want it enough. So now I have to say to myself, I think it's easier. Maybe the saying I'm scared of rejection is another excuse, because you just can't get it together. And then why can't we get it together? Every call that you sent out when you were and I think you still do calls for submissions, and they are really, really helpful. And I'll recommend a journal that's not an American journal that I have found incredibly helpful. It's a one-woman operation in England. She publishes poets from all over the world, but it's English speaking, but and translation some. It's called Orbis, Orbis, and along with the journal, which comes out, I think it's 3 times summer, maybe it's twice a year, maybe it's 3 times a year, I'm not sure, or 4. It's a beautiful journal, by the way, beautiful covers, and really good poetry, some short stories. There's a foremother or forefather, I forget what they call it in the beginning, lots of quality stuff. And one of the biggest services she does is, like, every month she sends out volumes of contests, calls for submission. And it's led me to some prizes, a couple of prizes, always in the UK. I have more trouble here than in abroad.
Well,
And
you're like Jimi Hendrix, right? You're
yeah, yeah.
gotta go away to get the
Yeah, and it helps
love.
to have the love. I'm going to England for the second time this summer to a writer's retreat, and a wonderful organization I'll mention called Second Light Poetry. And it's for women, I think they say over 40. There's a lot of women way over 40. The founder is, I think, past 80. She's a remarkable woman named Dilys Wood. Isn't that a great poet's name? Dilys Wood. And they have a retreat, and I went last summer, and it was also life-changing. So it's a really nice, finding not American, especially not East Coast, which is so harsh and competitive, and youth-oriented. I'm sorry, very youth-oriented, so.
Well, I hope for you that your poetry is seen by all who feel seen by your poetry. Hope it
Ah,
finds its people.
me too. And I think, again, I think I want to make a case for the fact that when I started writing, I even had a colleague that I taught with, and she was shut up by a wonderful male poet named Galway Cannell, a great poet. But at the time, I guess she was taking a course or workshop from him, and he said, "You write housewife poetry." And oh, again, when I wrote poems about children, when my children were young, there was no audience for them, there was no market for them. And I had a wonderful teacher, a wonderful poet also named Mary Stuart Hammond, terrific poet. She's recently deceased, but just terrific poet. And she said, you just have to find one editor who likes your poems. Of course, then the market went in another direction, and there's mom publications everywhere. And now there's going to be new publications about unmom being not, there's a lot of attention to we who choose not to have children and what that means. But our poems, I believe, are our children too.
Uh,
Yeah. I,
Sure. I'll allow it. I mean, I don't know.
I feel
I've never had kids. I don't know if my poems feel like children. They feel more like, I don't know. I don't know. I'm not very good
fruit,
at coming up with cool
fruits,
things to say. What did you say?
fruits of our labor.
Yeah.
Because I feel like the thing about the book, having a book come out, is really feels like a birth. I don't mean like, well, yeah, you go through the labor and the pain of making it and editing it, all that stuff. And then it happens. And of course, then you get what do you call it? The postpartum blues.
Oh,
But
well, your book has been out for a
a
year
year,
now, right?
yeah, yeah.
Um, so what's next?
Well, that's just it, Jen. I think what I'd really like to do, instead of trying to compile another big volume, the one that came before was 10 years earlier. My first book, Dangerous to Know, was 10 years earlier. And a few years before that was my only chapbook. So what I'd like, and by the way, in England, and I guess in Europe, they're called pamphlets. They don't call them chapbooks, but chapbooks have become a lot more, what's the word besides trendy? Valued, I think. And they have a history too, because they used to do more of these little books in the 19th century and earlier. But I think I would like to try to put together some, or the other thing, I would love to collaborate. Not really like a two-person book, but maybe an anthology. I I would like to collaborate. Here's something I started a long time ago and left it in midair. It was after my daughter's brush with death from a terrible bleeding illness in her childhood. And I met many other poets and artists, mostly poets, living with illness, either their own or someone they loved. And I started a project called Survival of the Soul. Um, Artists living with illness, their own or a loved one. And I got a huge collection of stuff, and I wanted to make, I guess, an anthology. And then I didn't follow it through. And many of the people are gone, or I don't know where they went. Uh, some beautiful work, and there was art too. So that's something maybe I should pick up to honor my younger past self and to honor people who survive.
Well, I look forward to getting to see that when it eventually comes out. Thank you for coming and chatting with me today, Patricia. This has just been an absolute pleasure to get to chat with you.
Thank you so much, Jen. I just felt so honored when you asked me, and I do feel honored. I just really think what you do is beautiful. And I look forward to, I'm going to watch all the interviews because I always refer to them, and then I want to see all of what you're doing. It's wonderful.
Thank
Thank you.
you. Thank you so much.
Namaste.
What a fun interview that was. I hope you had as much fun listening as I had talking. And wow, it was great to reconnect with Patricia. She and I know each other through Annie Finch's Poetry Witch community online. I used to be very actively involved in that. Then I started this podcast, and wow, it takes more time than I think that November Jen did not know how much time it took. And so scheduled a bunch of people to interview and then went, oh, wow. The interviews themselves don't take that much time. I mean, except for the one that Patricia and I did, because what you saw was cut down from 2 hours of footage, which is long for these. Usually it takes about an hour, and I cut it down to about 40 minutes. Um, but yeah, we talked for 2 hours. So you got to see the edited down version of that. But it's the editing itself that takes a long time, because that is not my skill. It's not my skill set. So it takes a bit of time. The point of that was to say that I haven't talked to Patricia in a long time, and it was just really a joy to get to chat with her. And I hope that you all enjoyed getting to eavesdrop in on our conversation. Patricia and I both also appear in the most recent anthology from Spelljar Press, Moonwater. If you want to know more about Moonwater, you can look at my interview with the editors from Spelljar Press. That aired at the beginning of May when the issue came out. So I hope you'll check out Spelljar Press because you can read Patricia's work and my work, and a lot of other great work is in there. So I hope you check that out, and hope you are having a good summer. It's a good summer for you. Thanks for stopping by.